So, so for those of you who are joining us for the first time, my name is Jocelyn Hurtado. I am the archivist at the Black Archives History Research Foundation, and my session is called "Is It True? Tales from the Magic City." Today I'm going to be talking about: is it true that Black indigenous Black Indians lived in South Florida? And I'm going to get a little bit into the history of that. But before we start, I also just want to make a comment, that at the Black Archives, we own and manage, the Historic Lyric Theater. We preserve the history of Black South Florida, including a lot of it's a great musical history. And I just want to take this time to remember the late Betty Wright, who passed away this weekend. And if you have time today, maybe after the segment, if you want to leave your favorite song from Betty Wright, that would be great. And after the segment, I suggest you to go, jam out to some of her music. All right. So I'm going to get ready to get started. So my session today: is it true that Black Indians lived in South Florida? So the reason I picked this topic is because a lot of people are not familiar with, Black Indians, just in general, the history of Black Indians in the country, and specifically to the South Florida region. And I've been fortunate enough at the Black Archives, I have available to me a lot of reading materials regarding this subject. And it also just brought me into curiosity how, that mixture of people, what was the racial relationship between Indians, Blacks, whites, and how did that come to be, and what did it look like here in the United States, specifically to Florida. Just even thinking about my own roots, my parents are from Nicaragua, but my genetic and ethnic makeup, I'm descendant of, Mary Indians, whites, Blacks, and then just all those people who came here and because of colonization were brought together. So it just made me think about what is the history of the Black Indians here in South Florida. And Black Indians in South Florida are commonly referred as to Black Seminoles, and that's because that's the group that they mixed with, which were the Seminoles. The Seminoles are the offshoots of the larger nation, the Creek nations, and once that nation, people from that nation began to migrate down south, they regionally changed their names into more, more select tribal names. That's where you have the Seminoles, the Miccosukes, you have the Choctaws, but they're all originally descended from the greater Creek nation. And so what I'm going to start with is, what are Black Seminoles? Black Seminoles are descendants of free Blacks, Black slaves, and people and also Indians, Native Americans. So they are a product of these two cultures. So we're going to start off our story before Florida became a state, before the United States was formed. So when Florida was under Spanish rule between 1513 to 1763, at that time, Spanish was under Florida colonial rule. Up north in the northern region of this territory, they were ruled by the British. And at that time, the Spanish were trying to maintain their colony, the Florida colony, and they would encourage slaves in the British colonies to run away to Florida to help defend its own territory. And they did this by saying, hey, if you run away, if you come here to Florida, if you come and protect our colonies, our towns, then you're going to be granted freedom. And one of the most well-known establishments of free Black slaves coming to Florida was Fort Mose. And that's an area that the executive director, Timothy Barber, mentioned last week during one of the segments. And Fort Mose was comprised of free Black slave fugitive slaves who moved here to Florida, and they were assigned the task to protect the colony base of St. Augustine. But a lot of the free blacks did not care to protect the Spanish colony, because at the end of the day, what were they doing for them? So they decided to move to other regions that were down south in Florida, to try to establish their own life. And what happened is that they started to interact and mix with the local indigenous population. And let's see. I just want to make sure I'm not forgetting anything. All right, give me a second. Okay. Okay. So yeah, so they started to mix with a lot of the indigenous population, and by the time the American Revolution started, there was really an influx of slaves moving down to Florida. They wanted to be free, and especially people from the Gullah region, which is coastal areas of Georgia and South Carolina. They saw the liberty opportunities down in Florida, and they started to migrate down. And these specific group of people were actually the ones who mostly mixed with the indigenous population here in Florida. And when they did, it was a really interesting result, because of how the Seminole tribes are, their population, their custom is constructed. For example, the Seminole tribe is a matrilineal lineage, so me basically saying that I'm sorry, I'm getting a little fuzzy. Let's see. So the word is escaping me. So basically, if you were a woman and you had a child, and if you were, let's say, if you were a runaway free black woman, a black fugitive woman, and you marry an Indian man, the child that you had was actually considered black, because lineage was followed through the maternal line instead of the paternal line. And because of that, there was a distinction between the two cultures. So the black Seminoles, the black fugitives that integrated and mixed with the Indians, they actually developed alongside. These two communities developed side by side, but they were not fully mixed together. For example, the black Seminole groups had their own type of language, which is similar to the Gullah language. They did incorporate some of the native indigenous words, but they primarily used the Gullah language. They did wear the attire and tribal wear of the Seminoles, but they did not live with the Seminole tribes. They would live in nearby regions. And technically, under this system, the Seminoles were considered to be their owners, but instead of having the traditional slave system, what they would do to the black Seminoles is they had to pay these taxes in the form of land, crops, in the form of different types of payment. For example, when the tribe was at war, the black Seminoles had to go and support the Seminole tribes that lived next to them, and support them during the raids. So I thought that was something that's really interesting, because even though there were a mixture of blacks and Seminoles, these two communities developed separately, and they were not fully integrated as I thought they would be. Okay, so right now I'm going to talk about the black Seminoles and what that meant when Florida ceased to be under Spanish rule. So Florida was annexed in 1819, and then the years that followed, it was a big push for these black Seminole free communities to be abolished. And at that time, it was nearing the Civil War. People in the South, the slave owners, did not want these plantation slaves to see that Florida was a safe refuge. So what happened was that Andrew Jackson actually came down to South Florida and started raiding some of these settlements. And one of the most settlements that was raided was, give me a second, it was called Negro Fort. Negro Fort was comprised of black slaves and the Choctaws Indians, the natives. And when Andrew Jackson came here, he actually destroyed the fort. A lot of the people that were captured were returned to plantations, and the ones that were freed and were survived, they actually moved further down south to Central and South Florida. And an interesting result of that I actually found out, that a group of these slaves actually went to the Bahamas. They're called the Black Seminoles of Andros Island, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about the history of that. Give me 1 second. Okay. Okay. So when Andrew Jackson started raiding the black tribals, black communities, black Indian communities here in Florida, a group of them decided to move to the Bahamas. But that was after a couple of attempts of going to the Bahamas and urging the British rulers, the British governors, to go help them. And after they were denied, they decided that they were actually going to settle and migrate to northern part of the islands, or northern islands of the Bahamas. And it was called Andros Island. And they established there around 150 to 200 black Seminoles actually moved to the island and lived there uninterrupted for 7 years. And it wasn't until the 7th year that the British officials actually discovered that they were living there. At first, these British officials thought that the Spanish actually left them there, and that they were eventually going to get picked up and they were going to be transported to a Spanish colony. But that was not the result. But what they did in the meantime during this confusion, they actually gathered around 90 black Seminoles and held them captured in jail for 1 year. After that, it was very apparent that this community actually decided to migrate on their own, that they were not dumped there by the Spanish. They were freed and released. And this community lived in that island basically uninterrupted, unbothered for more than 150 years. Due to its geographic location in the northern islands, that was a hard region to access by boats. Because of the shallow waters, they were not in danger of being recaptured by slave hunters. And because of the thick pine wood that grew in that area, it was not easily accessible. And the descendants of these black Seminoles that live in the Bahamas are actually still live there to this day. And because of their isolation, it was not uncommon for these families to intermarry. And a lot of the tribal tradition and customs are still practiced, and a lot of things that are, like, for example, the food, the type of food that they grow and the type of food that they eat is still seen to this day. And I actually read, I got all this information from give me a second. It's called the Journal, give me a second. It's called the Journal of Black Studies, Volume 37, number 2. It's pages 275 to 298. And the article is called The Wild Indians of Andros Island, Black Seminoles Legacy in the Bahamas. And it was not until the 1980s that an actual paved road was made to come into these communities. So even until now, there's a big descendants of these black Seminoles from Florida that still live there. So I found that really interesting because I did not know that. And if you look at the distance between, Central, even South Florida to the Andros Islands is quite a bit of distance, but they use these dug up canals that is typically seen in the Florida tribes, these wooden canoes that are dug up that can fit 20 to 30 people, and that's how they transported the South to the Bahamas. Yes. And, all right. So back to the Black Seminoles of Florida. So after Andrew Jackson started raiding these Black Seminole tribes and the native tribes of Florida, that led to the first and second Seminole Wars It was basically resistance to the American colonies expanding down south. And a big turning point was during the Second Seminole War, where there was the Indian removal policy that was made, and it was basically made to remove all the Indians and Black Seminoles from Florida to the Western territories. And if any of you guys are history buff, this removal policy did happen, and this migration was called the Trail of Tears. Approximately 500 Black Seminoles moved to the Western policy, and prior to their migration, they were actually promised to be free, but once they got there, they saw they were basically denied their freedom. A lot of them got captured and sent back to southern plantations. And then once they got there and they were there with the other Creek nations, they were actually denied their status as being part of the larger tribe. So it's really interesting, even complex history between the Black Seminoles and the larger Seminole tribes, because the Seminole tribes actually use the quantum blood rule. It's the same thing what was used in early American history, colonial South, the one drop rule. If you have one blood drop of black blood, then you were considered black. And in the Seminole tribes, they have the quantum blood rule, which is you need to prove that your 25% of your lineage comes from you're a descendant from an Indian member, an Indian tribe member. And it's been used against these Black Seminoles. They're called the Black Seminole Freedmen, and a lot of them are being denied their rights within the tribe in order to have access to the council, to the tribal council, and also larger settlements. So I found that really interesting, because even now within this day in the 21st century, there's a lot of pushback between the Black Seminoles and the larger Seminole tribe group. The Seminole tribe group is basically trying to exclude the Black Seminoles as being federally recognized as part of the group. And that also has to do with the restitutions that is given to the Black Seminoles. So after and I believe in the early 2001, the Black Seminoles were awarded like $46 million by the United States government because of the Western removal to the Indian removal policy that pushed them out west, because of that led to the Trail of Tears. And the Black Seminoles, who also moved there because of this policy, they were claiming their fair share of the awarded settlements, but the Seminole tribes actually denied their settlements, saying that they couldn't prove directly that they were descendants from any of these Black Seminoles that originally settled in Florida. So it's a pretty interesting history, a pretty complex history as well, that it definitely would take a lot longer than 30 minutes to cover. And I kind of glossed over a lot of things, but I just do want to reiterate that Black Seminoles did exist and live here in South Florida. They originally were established in the northern part of Florida. These were mostly runaway slaves that intermingled with the indigenous population. And as Florida ceased to become a Spanish colony and became under American rule, a lot of these free slaves and indigenous tribal members started fleeing down south in order to escape the slave bounty hunters, the raids, and everything. So they started moving more and more inland down south to the areas that we know now, known as the Everglades, to Central Florida. And I also want to mention that there is still a Black Seminole communities here in Florida. Their descendants are here, and let me just tell you where are they living. Okay, give me 1 second, and if any of you guys have questions, please feel free to ask. I also want to mention that the Black Seminoles, in form of food, they started growing yams, potatoes, corn, and they incorporated the traditional Seminole diet into their everyday daily lives. And as far as religion, the Black Seminoles still follow some form of Christianity that they picked up when they were in the southern plantations, but they did not fully merge into the existing religion that was believed by the indigenous tribes. Give me 1 second. Okay. 1 second. Alright. I have so many pages pulled up and I want to make sure I did not forget anything. But, so the region that the descendants, the Black Seminoles descendants live in here in South Florida, that region just escaped my mind, but I actually want to show you a picture of a famous Black Seminole called Abraham. He fought alongside Osceola. Osceola was the indigenous leader who resisted Andrew Jackson. So let me just show you a picture of the Black Seminole Abraham. Give me a second. All right. 1 second. Let me just do. All right. So this is the Black Seminole Abraham. And now I want to show you, there are pictures that survive of Black Seminoles. And Black Seminoles are not only used to refer to the group here in Florida, but also Black Seminoles in Oklahoma. Like I told you, the Western Indian removal policy forced the relocation of these groups of people to Oklahoma. And there is a community of Black Seminoles. So let me show you some pictures. So as you can see, the garments are traditional of indigenous wear. And these are some of the Black Seminole located in Oklahoma. All right, these are more pictures. And okay, and let me hear. And I also wanted to show you the article that I was reading that was titled The Wild Indians of Andros Island, Black Seminoles Legacies in the Bahamas, because I did not know that there were Black Seminoles in the Bahamas, and just to see that migration, the history of it is just pretty interesting. And there's also it's also important to note linguistically. Okay. It's also important to note linguistically, the Black Seminoles developed their own Creole, and they were actually used as interpreters by the British whites and the white settlers and the Seminole tribes to do business transactions such as bargaining and trades. So I thought that was pretty interesting as well. All right. So I'm going to wrap it up here, you guys. But if you have any questions, or if you guys want to mention what is your, what do you think about the Black Seminoles? Or like I said, if you want to let us know what is your favorite Betty Wright song, that would be greatly appreciated. And also, if you wanted me to discuss a certain type of topic, or you're curious about something about the history of Black South Florida, please let me know, leave a comment. And do not forget to, if you can, support us by donating to our Cash App at Vault through Cash App. I'm going to pin it. Give me a second. And I see, hey, Miss Brandon, I know you've done a lot of your ancestors' genealogy in the Bahamas, and I wanted to see, did you know any, have you heard anything about Black Seminoles? And I know sometimes my train of thought goes everywhere. It's because there's so many details. Like, for example, even just looking into the Black Seminole, I had to read about, Florida as a under Spanish rule, then when it became under British rule, and then again in the Spanish rule, and then you have the events such as the American Revolution, the Civil War, the War of 1812. You also have the First and Second Seminole War. So it's a lot of information and a lot of things to kind of keep track of. And it's a pretty amazing topic, so I really encourage you guys all to read up on it. Okay, I see a couple of comments. So it says, Mr. Braynon says, I heard that Black Seminoles, but I never knew there were amazing communities in Andros Island. Amazing. And she says, my husband is researching his family in Andros. Oh, look at that. That's pretty cool. Actually, I'm going to send you this link, and if you guys who are history buff, if you don't know, JSTOR, which is a online finding aid for periodicals, journals, scientific journals. They're offering 100 free articles to view online. You just need to put your email information, but you can view 100 peer-reviewed articles and access to different types of journals, studies, publications. So I really encourage you to read up on it. And it says, okay, so we do have someone who put their favorite Betty Wright song. It's called Tonight is the Night. Oh, I like that song too. It reminds me of my dad. My dad always plays that song. And it says, Maisha, my family is from there. Well, Maisha, who knows, you might be descendants of the Black Seminoles from Andros Island, because from what I read, they were basically a very isolated community who really did not merge or traded or mix with the rest of the other communities in the Bahamas just because of their geographical isolation. And I know that a lot of the typical food or customs might still survive through through the lineage, through time. So who knows, maybe a dish or a custom or that you never knew where that came from maybe has its origin on Florida's Black Seminole tribes. It's pretty cool. Okay. All right, and then just to wrap it up, I just want to let you guys know tomorrow is Today in Black History with Alicia Melton. Wednesday is Jeopardy Noir with the Executive Director, Timothy Barber. Thursday is Great Legacy Profile and Greatness with Louis Berthin. Friday is our virtual field trip. And Saturday is Storytime in Color with Camila Pritchett. And if you have any questions or want to recommend any topics, please feel free to do so by leaving a comment. And I hope you learned something new. And if you want more information, just send us an email. Bye, guys.